I was talking to Michael this morning, and I guess in some ways, trying to entice him to get excited about church. I also said to him, Michael, I'm going to be preaching on something that you're just going to love today. You are going to be so happy about what I'm preaching about today. And he said, well, what is it, Mama? And I said, well, I'm not going to tell you. I want you to come to church and experience it for yourself. And of course, then, as any child will do, he starts the barrage of, well, is it this? Is it about this? Is it about that? And at one point he said to me, he said, Mama, is it about superheroes? Is it about comic books? Is it about DC and Marvel universes? And he said, if it is, you better be spot on. Well, I'm telling you, that's too much pressure for me. So I was really glad when I could say to Michael, no, I'm not going to be talking about DC and Marvel comics. I'm not going to be talking about superheroes, at least not really. Because I actually ended up this morning at the 9 o'clock service, which is the service he participates in. I did end up talking about a superhero really as far as Michael is concerned, because I preached about his favorite person. Now, of course, that ought to be me, right? Mothers, yes, it ought to be me. But I knew from the get-go, the minute that I stepped off the plane, coming back to the United States from China, where we had received Michael in adoption, and one of my best friends was waiting there at the airport for us. And I saw the instantaneous bond between my best friend and Michael. And I knew from that point on that I would have to share Michael's heart with another woman. And it has been okay, because she is a marvelous woman. She is my friend Becky, and I felt so strongly about the place of her in Michael's life that when Michael was baptized, Becky became Michael's godmother. I met Becky when I moved from Massachusetts to Mississippi. She was in the first church that I served there. And we immediately recognized one another as belonging to the same tribe, so to speak. We recognized in each other that we were kindred spirits. And I'll tell you what, I was reeling a bit from that move from Massachusetts to Mississippi, and I really needed a friend at that point. She stepped right up into that just dearly cherished place in my heart. Now, until a few years ago, she lived in a spacious old home just on the outskirts of Brandon, Mississippi, which is not far from Jackson, Mississippi. And now, however, for about 3 years or so, she's been living in Chicago, because my friend Becky now works for the United Methodist Church on the big scale, for the national and international church. She works in the General Commission for the role and status of women. And she works in Chicago in the office there, and she's the senior director for sexual ethics and advocacy. She travels all over the country to all different kinds of conferences, and now she's even traveling internationally in order to help us in conducting our common life together with an eye for justice and advocacy. Now, she, of course, she just has an incredibly important job, and she loves her job at the commission. And I'm very happy for her. In fact, I was the one that sent her the job opening for this particular position. But in my heart, I still imagine her in that old house in Brandon, and I need and want to imagine her still there. She's renting out that house now to another family, but I still feel that I need her to be there, at least in my mind and my heart. Because Becky's house in Brandon became a very special place for me. Becky's house in Brandon is one of those places that has a presence. It's a house that has a sense of history. In many ways, I would describe it as a house that feels like a place on purpose. And it really has been around for a good while. There's an old structure on the property. I don't know exactly how old the house is itself, but there is an old structure on the property. It used to be an old smokehouse in its day, and it is one of the oldest structures in town, one of the oldest buildings dating before the Civil War. So when you go to Becky's house, the house is set back from the road, and that road is an old state highway. And Becky's house is settled on several acres of open land, and then there's woods in the back. And you drive up a curved, unpaved driveway, and you get a glimpse of the surrounding yard. And it's just beautiful. There is a large open green space. And this green space is dotted with mature pecan trees. And depending on the time of day, you'll often see several deer in her yard, along with all kinds of other wildlife. And so you pull up to her house and you notice that there's no shortage of space for you to park your car, either on pavement or on the grass, but you have to watch out for the blueberry bushes. And you also have to worry about that you don't park in those soft spots, that after a rain look perfectly fine, but they're super wet and squishy and your car gets stuck. That has happened to me before. But anyway, then you go up this stairs to this little side deck and a side door. Now, one thing I learned in a hurry in Mississippi is that no one uses the front doors. I'm not exactly sure why they're there, but I've never actually seen a family use it. Especially if you're among family and friends, you definitely use the back or side door or the door that goes through the garage. So my friend Becky has this side door area, and it looks particularly welcoming. There's a vine-colored trellis, and there's a brightly red, painted red bench where you can have a seat, and there's this little table that has various natural and artistic artifacts. The kind that people find stuff and they put it out, and it looks so beautiful, even though they probably found it at who knows where, side of the road, flea markets, whatever, but it looks beautiful. And there's also a large St. Francis statue by her front door, so you already begin to feel at peace. Immediately upon opening the door, you enter into the kitchen, and this is Becky's gathering place. We used to call it Becky's Bar and Grill. It isn't fancy, but it's homey. There's an antique butcher block that belonged to a real butcher in the center of the room, and it's often laden with all kinds of goodies. There are these old-fashioned bar stools by a high top counter that still has that 1960s, 70s yellow top to it. There's even a rocking chair in her kitchen. A rocking chair. Now, that says, come and sit a while. Here is the place where wonderful food was cooked or brought in, where folks helped themselves to a drink and they talked and talked and talked. This was the place in the heart of Becky's home where people told secrets, where they cried, where they laughed or told stories. And I spent many heart-to-heart evenings sitting at the counter on one of those bar stools myself. From the kitchen, French doors open onto a large covered porch, and below this is a big deck and a patio overlooking that beautiful, big, peaceful backyard and partially sheltered by a river birch tree. Here is where you find the grill, and it's usually fired up even on a hot and humid Mississippi night. There's a picnic table, rocking chairs, colorful Adirondack chairs, and in that deck there is built-in seating where you can sit on the edge of the deck. In other words, you see, the point is that there's a lot of places to sit, to visit with one another. There are potted plants, tomato plants, potted plants that hold herbs like basil and rosemary and mint, and there's a little lime tree as well. Here and there, like in the welcoming area by her back door, there are eclectic pieces of found art or artisan crafts, including an absolutely beautiful hand-sculpted fountain, so that everywhere you go in your backyard, you can hear the music of water running. And that fountain is in the form of a robust, seated woman holding out water for all to drink. And all around the porch are hanging lights that glow at night. And when you go back in, you go back inside, the rest of the house is made up of large and spacious rooms. And it's laid out in a single floor, so that when you walk into her house, you just have a sense that it goes on and on and on from one room to another. It conveys spaciousness just in the way it's laid out. And everything about the house is homey, inviting, warm, and comfortable. There's plenty of space for company, plenty of space for entertaining, for short-term and long-term guests, for extended family, and for friends. As I've mentioned, over the years, I've happily been to Becky's house more times than I could ever count. I've been with her one-on-one, on my own with her. I've been at informal gatherings with various small groups of people. I've been at large gatherings and parties with lots and lots of people. And no matter what the occasion, the overall impression of Becky's house is that it is precisely a house with room to spare. There's spare room for hospitality, for friendship, for family, for food. It's a place with room to spare for everyone and anyone. Always in Becky's house, all were welcome, white and black, male and female, white collar and blue collar, gay and straight, Democrat and Republican, single and married, messed up and put together. Whoever was looking for real people and big-hearted community. Becky's house is a place for festivity and for fun. At the same time, it was a place of refuge and of peace. Becky's house was a place where you could be exactly who you really are. And it was a place where you could get up, back up on your feet if you had fallen in some way. Michael and I were blessed to live with Becky for a month or so after my separation and while I was starting my new job in Jackson as chaplain at Millsaps College. I was 39 years old, and I had never lived on my own before. And I had gotten a little apartment just down the street, but honestly, I was kind of scared to death to move into it. And so I stayed with Becky. Michael and I stayed with her, and I built up my courage in her nest and finally was able to leave that nest for my new beginning, largely because of her care. And it was Becky's house where we went to in March of 2014 after our son Michael's first bone graft surgery. We wanted to be at Becky's house for his recovery and his healing. I miss Becky's house. In fact, I told the 9 o'clock that when I was writing this sermon on Friday, I just had tears streaming down my face. I miss that house and I miss Becky because I don't really see her a whole lot anymore. Because I miss the person whose presence and personality created such a place, such a house. Yet I'm happy. At the end of the day, I'm happy and thankful because I know the reality of Becky's house, because her house is one of the images that I draw on for what Jesus is promising in today's gospel reading from John. For me, her house is a living parable. We hear Jesus speaking these words in the gospel before he's arrested and crucified. He says, "Don't be troubled. Trust in God, trust also in me. My Father's house has room to spare. If that weren't the case, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? My Father's house has room to spare." That is just such incredible good news. Now, I don't know if Jesus was talking about a physical structure or a spiritual structure or both, or if he was talking about God's house as being God's presence, God's life, all of the above. All I know is that what Jesus is talking about, God's house, God's presence, God's life, that it is big and that it is a place of abundant life. So I imagine God's spacious, generous presence being like Becky's house. And I think it's really important for you to search your own experience and your own imagination so that you can draw on some images of what that spacious generosity looks like to you. Because in God's roomy presence, there is a place for us all. And there is also a place for everyone else. There's room to spare in God's great big life for all of us. And all that it takes to enjoy that big life is trust. All it takes is for us to trust God, to trust His spaciousness, to trust Jesus. Both when we die and in the here and now, Jesus uses that trust that we build as if it were a door to open. And He leads us by our trust into God's heart. He leads us by grace into God's household. And when we live within the experience of God's spaciousness, that's where we're going to find joy and friendship and peace and refuge and acceptance and support and love. This is such a wonderful image of God's presence being like a big, homey house. It's got room to spare for the whole family of God. God invites and includes everyone who trusts, not only the ones we would want to include or the ones that we feel comfortable including. It's open to all. God is not a private residence. God is not closed off. God is not our individual possession. And honestly, it's hard for me sometimes. It's hard for me to accept this sometimes. Because I don't know about you, when I hear the good news that God is preparing a place for me through Jesus, that God's preparing a place for me in God's life, I imagine something very private. I imagine it's all about me. I like to imagine a place of my own, just for me. I imagine sometimes a place where I could control things, that I could control who's there and who's not. I sometimes imagine a place where no one touches my stuff. Well, you know, when you leave home and everything's the same, when you come back, wouldn't that be something? I imagine a place that's quiet and calm because I'm kind of like a hermit. You see, David and Michael will tell you that I'm an extremely territorial person by nature. I like to have my space, my stuff. But God's house and my place in it aren't like this at all. This week I participated in Nancy Leonard's study on Adam Hamilton's book, Creed. And I was reminded that God's presence, God's life, God's house, and my place in it are about koinonia. Koinonia, and that's a Greek word for communion or sharing. Incidentally, and not by accident, it is the name of our student ministries. Our youth, under Austin's guidance, took on that name because they wanted to be a big space and a big place for our young people. Koinonia. So God's house and my place in it, it's not about me and mine. It is about communion with others and sharing with others, just like how it is at Becky's house. Koinonia, God's house, is about getting to know others. It's about building relationships with others. It's about actively caring for them and encouraging them. And I don't believe that that ends when we die. I believe that we are still making relationships with people, with all of the saints in God's household, even after we die. It's all about sharing and communion. The purpose of our having a place in God's spacious house, in God's abundant life, is precisely to foster and build and serve as a community of people who are devoted to one another as sisters and brothers, that we are bound together by a common faith, and that we work together to live that faith in the world and in the world that is to come. The purpose of God's house having room to spare is so that we can all be Christ's family together, and that we can find our place in that family, again, after we die, but also importantly, in the here and now. And it is in the here and now that we get to have the opportunity to practice having room to spare. The church is one dimension of God's house in the here and now. And the church ought to be a place where there is room to spare. The church should be a place where everyone has a place prepared for them. And this is true for our local church here in Ocala, as well as for our denomination, the United Methodist Church. And I think we need to remember this room to spare, especially as our denomination is in a time of stress and conflict and divisiveness. Again, my plumb line is my image of Becky's house. And so I think of these questions when I think about church. Is the church a place where everyone who is seeking to grow in trust invited and welcomed? Is the church a place of growing friendship with God and with each other? When we are here in church, are we really present to one another? Do we spend time with one another? In church, are we able to be real and authentic with each other? Are we accepting of diversity and difference? Is the church a refuge and a place of peace, not only for me and mine, for you and yours, but for everyone? And is the church a place that's fun and joyful? Is the church a place where we can be vulnerable and cry, and a place where we can find our solid ground again? Do we find our place in the church when we're messed up as much as when we're put together? Is the church a place where we can forgive and heal? And do we feel so happy about and thankful for our church that we want to invite and bring others into our gatherings? Now, as we move forward as a local congregation with our particular vision and goals as a church family, as David and I work with leadership with all of you in determining what that vision is and what are our goals are going to be for the immediate future, I feel the need to hold these questions in my heart, because I feel that these questions serve to challenge and guide us, to make sure that we're not making ourselves too cramped or too cluttered a place by being territorial or closed off or exclusive or judgmental. The second chapter of 1 Peter says that we ourselves are being built like living stones into a spiritual temple. We, this church, we are an expression of God's house, God's spacious house. Jesus is preparing a place here in Ocala right now for others, and this place is us. And we need to trust Him enough to expand with His grace and become a spacious place for all. As I look around our church and as I enjoy walking about, I realize how blessed we are by an expansive campus. We're blessed by roomy facilities that are in good working order, that have been taken care of. And we're blessed by generous resources. Oh yes, we have the potential to grow. But let's make sure that when we grow, that we're not only big in size, but that our shared life together has got room to spare. In the name of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, amen.